Good afternoon and good morning to our friends in the far west and around the world. We are going to wait a few minutes as people are entering the National Town Hall, and we'll start in just a couple minutes. Thank you. All right, I think we are ready to roll. So welcome. The Road to Recovery for Mass Violence Survivors and Communities is our 7th virtual forum in our National Town Hall series. Today, we have an exemplary panel of folks who have taken that long road to recovery and some who are still on it. We're joined today by 438 registrants from 41 states and the District of Columbia and from 11 countries around the world. Notably, over 6 out of 10 registrants today are from a community that has experienced a mass violence incident, and 35% have themselves responded to an MVI in a professional capacity. We are always grateful to the U.S. Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime, and this is our disclaimer that you will see throughout the entire National Town Hall. A few quick housekeeping announcements. This National Town Hall will be recorded, and after being posted to our website, the recording, the slide deck, and a really great list of resources will be available for download at our website. You can also find archives of all of our previous National Town Halls there. If you're joining us by telephone, please email us at info@nmvrc.org with your full name and address so you can receive credit for attending. And we want to thank all of you who sent questions for our presenters in advance. We're going to save time at the end to answer as many of those questions as possible. We always start with just a warning about trauma cues. We're going to refer throughout this town hall to several mass violence incidents as examples, but we will not be discussing the details of the events. There will also be several media images on slides that reference mass violence events. So if you need to take a break from the presentation, please feel free to do so. We have quite a few learning objectives for today. You are going to identify long-term trauma and trauma cues that affect survivors and also how to mitigate them. We're going to talk about long-term trauma that affects mass violence impacted communities and how we can mitigate those within the communities. You're going to learn about effective strategies to do both individual and community needs assessments during the longer-term recovery phase of an incident, and also identify best practices for annual commemorations and permanent memorials that are such an important part of the recovery process. We're also going to describe unexpected challenges that may arise in the long-term aftermath of a mass violence incident, but also strategies that can address them. And finally, we're going to describe important skills and strategies, some really key takeaways needed by professionals for the road to recovery. We have an amazing panel today, and in the interest of time, I'm going to do very brief introductions. I do encourage you to go to your registration information and read the full bios of these dynamic women. I'm Ann Seymour, I'm your moderator today. We are going to be joined first by our program manager at the Office for Victims of Crime, the wonderful Eugenia Pedley. My colleague, Dr. Alyssa Reingold, is the NMV VRC Preparedness, Response, and Recovery Division Director, and she'll be talking about individual and community needs assessments. You're going to hear the power of the personal story from Amy O'Neill. She is a Boston Marathon bombing survivor, has her own consulting firm, and we're so proud that she's a member of our Survivors and Providers Steering Committee. You'll also hear from Tennille Pereira, a wonderful attorney who's the executive director of the Vegas Strong Resiliency Center. And she is a member of our NMV VRC Resiliency Center Directors Forum. And last but not least, you're going to hear from our research instructor, Arroyo Sanz-Bell, who will be talking about the unexpected challenges facing communities in the aftermath of MVIs. So we're going to start with welcome remarks from Eugenia Pedley. Eugenia.
Thank you, Anne, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad that you can join us today. As Anne said, my name is Eugenia Pedley, and I handle the mass violence and terrorism programs at OVC. And for those of you who don't know about us, in 1984, Congress established the Office for Victims of Crime under the U.S. Department of Justice through an amendment to the Victims of Crime Act known as VOCA. One element of OVC's mission is to plan for and respond to mass violence and terrorism events. It's through this response lens that we'll be discussing today's topic. Little about mass violence response is simple, not through the eyes of first responders, the survivors themselves, or the people who serve them. It's often complex, messy, and challenging under the best circumstances. It shouldn't be surprising then to realize that the road to recovery isn't straightforward all the time either. Many factors can play into how things unfold: the nature of the incident itself, how the aftermath evolved, how many victims and how much of the community were impacted, whether there's a trial, and so forth. Some dynamics also depend on the survivors, their families, and what they were dealing with in their own lives when the event occurred. The incident was probably unlike anything they'd ever experienced and did not occur in isolation. People may have already been struggling with past trauma, health or mental health issues, or other challenges. Conversely, they may be fortunate and have strong social support or other positive elements in their lives that can make the recovery process just that tiny bit smoother. In essence, everyone is starting from a different place, so we should expect each journey to be a little bit different. I hope that you'll find yourself thinking about the materials presented today and that they will help you in your life and in your work. Thank you, and now I'll turn it back over to Anne.
Thank you so much, Eugenia, and I think everyone understands why we have such great appreciation for you, Eugenia, and for OVC, and the guidance you provide not only to our center, but to our entire field. We sure appreciate it. So the power of the personal stories of mass violence survivors and lived experiences of community leaders are important touchstones in our discussion today about the road to recovery. Blondell Gadsden is a member of Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. In 2015, a white supremacist shot and killed 9 parishioners during Bible study, including Blondell's sister Myra Thompson, who was leading the Bible study group. Since then, Blondell has been active in the community and on the commemoration planning committee in honor of Myra and the other church members who were killed. Mass shooting survivor Blondell Gadsden.
I am Blondell Gadsden, a member of Mother Emanuel AME Church, and my sister Myra Thompson was one of the victims in the June 17, 2015 massacre. And so I'm here to talk about the road to recovery as a result of having to go through that heinous ordeal. For me and my family, I think the thing that's been most helpful is the counseling services that we have received. We have been given instructions or suggestions about how to participate in activities that will help to calm and get us focused in a more positive way. Myra is the driving force behind a lot of things that I've been doing these past 8 years, because of the person that she was, always willing to do things in the community, help those who were in her neighborhood, that couldn't get out, the sick and shut in, the less fortunate. And so she has given myself and the family members who are close to the commemoration and work with the committee the ideas and suggestions that we use to promote programs and activities that we try to sponsor. I know for my family, having a strong faith base has been the main reason that we are able to keep our heads above water and go through the healing process and take the time we need. The thing that I appreciate is having individuals in the counseling field or um, faith based uh, field to reach out, even if it's just a text message or an email, thinking about you. Those little things are so helpful in helping you to understand that you're not alone, and you know that there are other people you can go to when things aren't going well. So just little things like that have made a big difference. We've received emails and text messages from people in the judicial system. Just knowing that we haven't been forgotten is a big, big help. And I know that we all enter and leave the healing process at different times. So, what might look like my healing process is going to look different from somebody else's.
I want to say thank you to Blondell for sharing and honoring her sister Myra's legacy, and for reminding all of us that 6 years later, it's still important for us to reach out to survivors of mass violence. And now we're going to hear from Orlando Mayor Buddy Dyer, who is a good friend of our center and a guiding light to any mayor whose community endures a mass violence crime. On June 12, 2016, 49 people were murdered and 53 people were physically injured at Pulse nightclub in his city. Over the past 7 years, Mayor Dyer has worked with our principal partner, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, to educate other mayors about his lived experience and the long road to recovery, often reaching out personally to them to offer his support. Orlando Mayor Buddy Dyer.
I'm Orlando Mayor Buddy Dyer. Thank you for taking part in today's town hall. Like too many communities, Orlando was forced onto the road to recovery after 49 innocent lives were taken at the Pulse nightclub in 2016. The tragedy also physically and emotionally injured many others. More than 7 years later, our community is still on the road to recovery. That is one of the reasons why today's town hall is so important. What happened in Orlando can happen anywhere. The harsh reality is that mass shootings and other mass violent events can impact any city. Following these tragedies, our country immediately erupts into political debate about how we can prevent this from happening ever again. But it is you, the survivors, victim service providers, behavioral health professionals, first responders, and elected officials that are left dealing with the devastating aftermath felt in the weeks, months, and even years to come. But we're not helpless. Serious preparation will put you in the best possible position to start your community down the road to recovery. In Orlando, our city government's long practice of conducting regular emergency management tabletop exercises prepared our staff to respond to the most devastating day in our history. In whatever profession you practice, in whatever role you fill in the response to an emergency event, I hope that resources like today's town hall will prepare you to help your community down the road to recovery.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor Dyer, and also just for reminding us that a community's readiness and response is foundational to the long-term road to recovery. And now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Alyssa Reingold, who's going to talk about needs assessments. Alyssa?
Great. Thank you so much, Anne. And thank you all for being with us today. We have a great lineup of speakers. And before we kind of get into some concepts as it relates to ways to best help individual survivors, victims, and family members, and ways to help community members at large, I think one of the first things that we need to consider before we get into implementing anything is first to just take pause to recognize the needs of survivors and the needs of communities, as that can evolve and change over time. And so being mindful as professionals that, we might not always know what the folks we work with and communities we work with need, and we need to continuing to assess and gather feedback and input to help drive what it is that we do. I'm going to talk a little bit about two different types of assessments. One is individual needs assessments. These are instruments to directly assess clients, victims, survivors, family members, community members who may be impacted, to ask kind of where they're at in their stage of healing and what their needs for services may be. You want to make sure you're accommodating your assessments, that they are inclusive of cultural considerations, language considerations, gender, age, geography, context of the community that the individuals that you serve work in. And so you really want to pay attention. There's not one individual needs assessment that will fit everybody. And you want to make sure you're tailoring those types of assessments specifically reaching out to the traditionally marginalized and underserved individuals in assessing their needs and their unique needs for services. When it comes to the initial needs assessments, you want to do a needs assessment early on, shortly after an incident occurs, sort of in the immediate short-term phases of a mass violence incident. These can be conducted by professionals, sometimes at the Friends and Relatives Center or the Family Assistance Center, often in consultation with the Office of Victims of Crimes Training and Technical Assistance Center. You want to ensure whatever victim or survivor needs assessment that you do is confidential and is trying to adjust their basic needs, their needs for assistance, their victim rights needs. So that way you can make some recommendations of what your community might need to do to address some of those needs in your longer term planning. So not only do you want to assess individual needs, but you also want to assess your community and your community capacity to address the needs that might be impacted by that mass violence incident. So looking at the capacity for your victim service agencies, the capacity of your mental health and behavioral health services, and the expertise in trauma-informed care and trauma-focused care. And how can you then identify what those are so then you can best strengthen and support your community in that both initial response and that ongoing recovery response. And as I mentioned, needs shift and change over time. So you want to be reaching out both individually to individuals to assess their needs over the long term and their community capacity needs over the long term. And this is where the role of resiliency centers can be very crucial in that process. For your reference, there have been, over the course since the concept of resiliency centers have been established, there's been over 24 resiliency centers that have served communities at any given time. We do have a monthly forum of our current active resiliency center directors that meet to be able to share lessons learned and to support one another. But often the resiliency centers can be a hub to be able to continue that ongoing needs assessment of survivors and victims. And those can be conducted by victim navigators or mental health professionals in resiliency centers. It can help understand what are unmet needs over time that have developed, or new ones that have been created over the course of the long-term impact of an incident. It could impact people's financial needs. It can impact their holistic needs, their physical health, in addition to their mental health well-being. And hopefully then through that, then navigators can help connect them to those resources. And again, you want to make sure that as you're assessing those long-term needs, that they are tending to the specific needs of your victims, their culture, their language, their age, and there's a form of outreach that's being done to be able to go out to communities, to be able to connect with survivors, and not expecting everybody to come in. Now, I wanted to highlight just briefly, since we're talking about community needs, and as I mentioned, resiliency centers are a great hub to be able to do that in their specific community that's been impacted. We at the National Mass Violence Center have been looking at sort of the long-term community impact of mass violence incidents. And we are currently conducting or have conducted a number of community needs assessments in several different communities: Parkland, Dayton, Pittsburgh, El Paso, San Bernardino, and Virginia Beach. And we've gathered some key findings. We also have done some needs assessment with those impacted in Vegas. Those have been a little bit more specific to victim needs. But here we're looking at community members at large, not just those individual direct and indirect victims, but how does mass violence impact community members at large? And interestingly, we have found that community members at large are at increased risk of post-traumatic stress disorder. So approximately 10% of community members reported current PTSD. 23% reported past year PTSD, which is significantly higher than the national average. Similar rates with depression: 9% of community members at large reported current depression, 17% reporting past year depression, again, higher than our national rates of depression, which is around 8 to 9%. And we look at specific types of events that could impact that. And this is just another image looking specifically at Parkland, El Paso, and Pittsburgh, highlighting the 4 to 5 times higher rates of PTSD and depression in community members at large that have been impacted by mass violence. But when we look at some specific factors that play a role, some of the things that we are finding, which is not surprising in the victim service field, is that those that report low levels of social support have increased risk for PTSD and depression. And those that report significant other exposures to other potentially traumatic events like physical assault and sexual assault are at greater risk of PTSD and depression. So from a victim service perspective, thinking about how when we think about long-term recovery and responding to communities, not only thinking about your direct and indirect victims, but perhaps thinking about community members that have prior victimization and that have low social support because they're at risk of going on to having significant difficulties in the aftermath of a mass violence incident. We also know that there's a number of pre and post event factors that also lead to increased risk of long-term mental health difficulties. Not everybody goes on to have long-term difficulties. Many people are resilient and they're on that fostering healing, but there are some that are at greater risk for more difficulty. And those risk factors include what they experienced during the incident, the characteristics of the incident. For instance, if it was a hate-based crime, other social determinants of health of that individual that they may be carrying, their prior trauma experience, their prior mental health difficulties could put them at risk. Their social support network, do they have low social support? Because that could be a risk factor. And then we have learned that media exposure and can sometimes be an impact. So just wanted to highlight just a couple food for thought on how to assess think about considerations in assessing individual needs, assessing community capacity needs, and then what we're learning in the field of communities that have been impacted by mass violence. And with that, hopefully I will then tee it off so that way you can hear more about, okay, what do we do about that? Thank you.
I want to say thank you, Dr. Reingold. And we were at the OBC VOCA Center conference last week in Chicago, and a survivor on the victim panel said, I didn't know what I needed. And that's why it's just so important for us as professionals to help them with the needs assessments. And a quick review, you all will find after a mass violence incident, there's outpouring of support in the immediate and short term, but we have to really look to strengthen the community's capacity over the long road to recovery. So thank you so much, Dr. Reingold. And now it's time for Amy O'Neill, my friend, my colleague, and someone who's an inspiration to all. Amy?
Thanks, Anne. Let's move right into long-term healing. Thank you, Alyssa. I just want to start by acknowledging what Blondell said in the beginning, which speaks to my first slide here, which is not alone, not forgotten, and everybody's on an individual journey here. So healing is rarely what we expect. And I think Eugenia said it in her introduction, and Dr. Reingold did as well, that it's complex and shifting and changing, and that every path is different. So from a survivor perspective, victim perspective, or person impacted, know that every path is different and unique. Next slide. Survivors and people impacted, victims, I've had the good fortune of been exposed to people from all over the world that have had to face mass violence or terrorism. And this is a very common construct that people talk about, which is life before and life after, and how in a moment of time your life changes in an unimaginable way. And I put here the messy discovery in between, because when we talk about long-term healing, I think so much of what we do is wrestle with the life that we knew before this mass violence incident or act of terrorism. And then what does it mean about life after? Who are we now? How do we move through the world? What has changed? And sometimes those changes are physical, sometimes they're emotional, sometimes they're both. But what we're really learning to do is trying to figure out how we now live with this experience. When we responders and service providers, what you're working with when you encounter a victim or person impacted by mass violence is you are working with everything that is trapped inside this person that's sitting across from you, or this person that you're helping. The sights, the sounds, the sensations, the fears, the thoughts, the emotions. So again, it was already said at some point already that to be patient, to be trained, to be adequately trained and trauma informed. And although this image could be disturbing to look at, I think it's important because it really does show that so much is happening, that somebody, that's been impacted by mass violence. And I chose this photo because in that dust cloud somewhere is exactly where I was at the time of the marathon bombing. Next slide. The journey, the long-term journey for many victims, survivors, people impacted, you'll notice I'm using those terms interchangeably because, again, one of the things that we want to do is make sure that we're addressing people impacted in a way that feels right and comfortable for them. Some people prefer victim, some people prefer survivor. Person impacted, I think, it's a bigger encatchment. So there's no agency in victimization. And one of the things that we all go through is trying to figure out what our place is in this recovery journey. What is our place in society after what's happened? As Dr. Reingold mentioned, a small percentage of people impacted may develop PTSD, but many people with subclinical symptoms would benefit from counseling, or we'll notice that they have something going on that just doesn't feel right, and they might need some care in the short term and long term. I think it's important to note that some people don't seek out treatment immediately. It could be 1, 3, 5, or 10 years that the accumulation of traumatic incidences or the way that it comes to the surface. And that messy in between I talked about too is this: we are finding our place, and how does being impacted by an MVI become a part of your identity? Dr. Reingold also mentioned, and I just wanted to highlight as well, that prior trauma and personal experiences matter a lot and sometimes do really impact the healing trajectory. Next slide. Some therapeutic considerations that are important for providers in the best way to support people impacted by MVI is knowing or having knowledge of the unique context of what it means to be a victim of a mass violence incident. It's a very unique experience depending on what kind of incident you have gone through. as a service provider, asking about that trauma history that's been mentioned. And the research also is supporting, encouraging this social support, and also being familiar with peer support. Survivors, people impacted, often find comfort in the familiarity of sharing stories with other people that have been impacted by mass violence. It's a place where you don't feel alone. And with these peer support groups, when they're a safe space, people have an opportunity to find the language and share their story. I put on the bottom of the slide here, and this was a quote from somebody I know from the Pulse nightclub community. And his advice on a panel that we were on together was to listen for the whispers. And I think that's a fabulous piece of advice. And it's just a beautiful way of helping service providers know that it's really important to listen for the things that people say, maybe not loudly as well. For people impacted, and this was mentioned as well, I think themes are going to emerge. Sometimes we're not sure what we want or need until we hear it. So as responders, as victim service professionals, even as Mayor Buddy Dyer was saying, even to be aware of these unique challenges that people impacted by MVI, if we hear you talking about social support, if we hear you talking about counseling, if we hear you talking about emotions that are common, that's helpful to know that you're not alone. It's helpful for persons impacted not to be judging ourselves or comparing our stories against others. And one piece of advice here for people impacted is not to stop searching for what you need. Sometimes there's this draw and thought that you need something, you're looking for something, you're not quite sure what, but if you keep asking around and talking to people, sometimes you're going to be able to find it. The long-term community impact is sometimes very different from the long-term individual impact. So this hierarchy in communities, many responders are already familiar with. And it's interesting, we as people impacted, sometimes you feel that bereaved have suffered the most significant, and then physical injuries, and then emotional or psychological injuries. But what we know is that it doesn't, we are all judging ourselves. So it's helpful to know that that hierarchy in community is something that happens, and to be addressing that and giving that validation for each unique experience along the way can be helpful. Year markers is another opportunity to provide that support for a community that's impacted. We heard in the opening video again with Blondell that not being forgotten, and those year marker events are opportunities to say, we see you, we still think about you, we know that you're here. Increased stress and anxiety. I think there's research, even more research coming out that does demonstrate that people that have been previously impacted sometimes fear and worry that something will happen again. I know that I have gone through that at times, large scale events, being nervous or being anxious that that's potentially a target. And that goes back to that life before and life after, when something unimaginable happens in a quick moment, we're not sure, or we're thinking that it could happen again. So next slide. So hope and support, recognition, validation, know that we're out there, be reassuring, and help to be reassuring, for service providers that healing is possible, and that we trust, help teach people impacted to trust your capacity, that we have what it takes to get to that next step in the recovery process. Foster that resilience. We mentioned that there was no agency in victimization, so really fostering that self-efficacy. Reminders that the worst thing already happened, we're now in a healing process, sometimes can be helpful. And having this belief that it gets better. Sometimes when it's hard to find that support within yourself, social support and peer support is a way to foster that in the meantime. Reminders and trauma cues, news of other attacks. I'm sure there are many other people impacted that no longer watch the news, or when we do hear about a subsequent MVI, it's really destabilizing in a lot of ways. We are reminded of how lonely and sad and awful it feels, and this empathy and sympathy gets activated, thinking about other people that are going through this. So limiting media consumption can be helpful, and it can help to break that cycle of distress. It can also magnify existing problems that are going on. So that's another thing to be thinking about. And that feeling of being out of control, vulnerable, or lonely, these are ways that trauma cues can get activated. Cues can also be internal. Our own feelings, our own sensations are reminders of the incident that you have survived. So court hearings is another, you know, when they're happening, when we're hearing about them, that can be very activating as well. Next. So what can we do about trauma reminders? And I love this image, the art of precious scars. We learn to live with it. We learn to carry it. It is a part of our identity. So how do we move forward knowing that it is a part of your identity? So learning mindfulness and regulation strategies, other evidence-based strategies that help you deal with when we're activated or have trauma reminders. Limiting that news exposure. Self-compassion and self-care is huge, especially the self-compassion piece. As people impacted, sometimes we judge ourselves so harshly, and have a sense that not having lost more, all kinds of things go on. So trust your capacity that you can work through it, and really work with your community partners. Next slide. And then we have post-traumatic growth. So we've gone through this horrible event, and there's this positive change. You work through it, you work through the struggle, you work through the challenges that come with it. And you will notice that many survivors, many people impacted go into advocacy. We heard that in the opening video as well, carrying on the legacy work of her sister. Meaning making is really important, I think, to understand why I went through what I went through. Sometimes with post-traumatic growth, there's a new appreciation for life and a newfound personal strength, and there can be spiritual changes or strengthen relationship with others as well. Next slide. So key takeaways for people impacted, for victims and survivors: find your place, find the words and the language to help you describe what you've been through. Find a safe place to belong so that you're not lonely, whether it's social support, peer support, or professional support, whatever feels best to you. For communities, don't forget. For keeping victims and survivors an important part of the conversation when we're talking about commemorations or year markers, and having in the front of your mind always, for service providers, that physical and psychological injuries both matter, and they matter equally. Don't judge others, don't judge yourselves, and make all contact with people impacted by mass violence trauma informed. And by doing that, we can prevent further re-traumatization or victimization. Thank you. And just as a final note, I think this is a fitting slide to end on. This is my son, Brian, who's now 21 years old. And this past April, on the 10-year anniversary, we ran the Boston Marathon together. And to put it in context, he was just 10 years old at the time of the bombing. So he grew up with this being a major event in his life. And we had this opportunity this past year, which was really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that beautiful photo and reminding all of us to listen for the whispers. Thank you so much. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Tennille Pereira, who's the Executive Director of Vegas Strong Resiliency Center. Lots of things to share with you about community strengthening on the road to recovery. Neil?
Thank you, Anne. I'm happy to be here with you all today and kind of talk about some of my experience working with the impacted community from the 1 October Harvest Festival shooting here in Las Vegas. So a couple big things to keep in mind when you are looking at your remembrance events or your year marker events or ceremonies is language really matters. It is really important that you engage with your impacted community and audience to hear what could be a trauma cue or an activator, so that you control the messaging and you plan the messaging across the community in a way that is going to be healing for them. So one of the things that we learned early on here in Las Vegas is that a lot of people did not like the term anniversary, because it's often associated with positive life events. So when you're thinking about, a wedding anniversary, right, or those types of things, it doesn't fall in the same category as remembering possibly the most traumatic day of your life. And so changing the language so that you separate it from those positive things in their life, we learned early on was very important to them. And so we are very careful with our wording. In conjunction with that, as we plan different events or we work with our community partners or different events that are being planned throughout our community, we also work to educate them and let them know why this word is important, or watch out for this word. And then within your own impacted community, there are certain terms that they want used. So for our community, they didn't like the term 1 October as the event. They liked it more associated with the Route 91 Harvest Festival. But then we had community members that didn't know what Route 91 was. So we worked to create language, and now we reference the 1 October shooting at the Route 91 Harvest Festival. So again, just engaging with your impacted audience to know what are the terms and language that are important with them, then working throughout your community to educate your community on that. One of the other really big things that prior to getting into this work, I wasn't aware of is a traumaversary, and what a traumaversary can do, or the impacts in the impacted community. So it is really the manifestation of remembered trauma around the anniversary of the event. This doesn't mean that people that are feeling this effect are even necessarily aware that they're feeling the effect. And so it's important to kind of educate the impacted community around the year mark about this, and that, those that are impacted may need extra additional supports around this time. We need to take this into consideration when we're planning events. I remember speaking with another mass violence impacted community, and their very first 1 year mark, they went to Disneyland. And they thought, well, we wanted to go and we wanted to have some fun. But then the lesson that they learned when they were there, it was awful, and it was the last place that they wanted to pee on that day. There will be different feelings and different emotions, and it will be manifested in different ways in different individuals. But to keep that in mind when you're planning remembrance events throughout your community, and again, educating your community on that. Next slide. So some of the programming objectives will be different based on the different impacted groups within your impacted community that you'll be serving, as well as the organizations that are putting on the event. So in our community, there are events from our Resiliency Center, from our county, from our city, from different survivor groups, from the family group, and then the community as a whole often will do their own as well. So when we're looking at our events, we're looking at several different objectives. One is providing education and coping skills for our impacted community. So it is a good time to kind of educate on different therapies, different programs that are there to support them, to teach them, help connect them to different coping skills and mechanisms that they can use for that year mark, but as well as like through the rest of the year, because a lot of times we are able to connect with a lot more people on the year mark than different times of the year, because they're often thinking about it a lot more during this time. We create opportunities for them to connect. You heard from Amy earlier about the importance of connection, the importance of peer support, and really creating that community around them. It helps. They validate one another and what they've gone through. Of course, we work in our education and outreach to do that as well. But it also helps normalize the experiences that they're going through to connect with one another. Then we work on a lot of outreach, again, to reach those that have not gotten support yet. We had people all over the globe that we've worked to connect with, and so we continue to do that. But we also use this as a prime opportunity to educate the community on the needs of our survivors, our bereaved families, and generally the impacted community. So, different objectives there from our perspective and from the events that we do ourselves. Then generally, we do provide a lot of support to the impacted community. We will do a lot of emotional support. So we'll work with our behavioral health community partners to make sure emotional support is out there in the community. A lot of times people will come to some of these events, and depending where they are in their healing journey, certain things might activate them and they might need some additional emotional support that they didn't anticipate, or they might respond in a way that they didn't anticipate. And so it's really important to have that emotional support element there. And then we also help the impacted community with outreach to get the word out for their events. And this really comes into play when we have our survivor community. They are big country Western fans. They love concerts, they love gatherings. And they generally do a big event they call it the Route 91 family. But it's a lot of logistical work, and also to get the word out there for that outreach piece. We always connect with them as they begin their planning and say, hey, what are you guys planning to do? How is it that we can support you? And that often means helping them do their outreach and look for ways to put on these different events. So we're really trying to meet them where they are to meet their needs. And then just the outreach in the community. We educate, again, the community about the survivor and family needs, ways that they can support them. We work very diligently in controlling the narrative. There is a lot of opportunities to do media when the year mark comes around, and there's always, there's always a negative message that you can find, right? And the media has a tendency to really kind of dig those things out, even though 90% of the time it really is a positive message. And so we work to make it a healing remembrance and a healing narrative. And so we work with our community partners to also share that messaging from the early planning stages. And then we inform our impacted community regarding services. So this is an example of our last messaging outreach effort that we did at our 5-year mark. It was from the darkest night comes the strongest light. And then we did an activity for the entire community to participate in that went along with that theme. And then we shared it with our media partners. We shared it with every group that we work with, and it kind of really went out there, and it helped kind of fashion the narrative to create a healing atmosphere for the 5-year remembrance events for that time. Next slide. So community collaboration is your force multiplier. A lot of times I hear people ask me, how do you do all this? And I'm like, I don't do all this. I work with a lot of community partners. Everyone takes part in this, right? This is a collective, collaborative effort across the community. And so we really engage our mental health partnerships. You know, I want to make sure that the things that we are doing are fostering healing. I want to make sure I have the emotional support out there. You know, our government entities, the other impacted groups. We use each one of these in our planning. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about creating a permanent memorial. So permanent memorials can be very healing. They do create a physical connection to those that have passed. You know, a space for mourning, celebration, a place to remember, to acknowledge, validate, and remember, and educate future generations. Next slide. And these are the big lessons that I've learned leading our 1 October Memorial Committee. And really, I want to say that it comes down to setting the stage and making sure that you have the right pieces in place, that you have the trust and respect of one another, that you foster that so that you get the trust and respect of the impacted community, that you engage the impacted community, that you listen to them, you validate them, you know, you give where you can give, and that you're honest with them. Next slide, please. If you have integrity, nothing else matters. If you don't have integrity, nothing else matters. What you tell them in the message isn't always a resounding yes, but if they know you heard them and they know that you've been honest and you've given where you can, it will be healing. Next slide. And this is the goals from our 1 October Memorial Committee. And I just wanted to put this up there so that you can see that very top point is to lead a process for community engagement to foster healing. The recommendation that we make for the actual memorial is important, but it comes second to the healing process. Next slide, please. And then I wanted to share this because this gives you the link to our page where you can see what our process was, the different steps that we went through. We've been doing this, we did it for about 3 years. We just approved our memorial, but it was a eye-opening healing process for everyone involved. So I wanted to share that. And next slide. And I just want to leave you with this, and that is sometimes we need someone to be there with us, not to fix the problem, not to offer advice, not to do anything in particular, to simply be present with what we're feeling, to show up and acknowledge what we're going through and hold a supportive space, safe space for us to be with what's showing up for us. And if you keep that in mind in your remembrance planning and your memorial planning, you'll foster healing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tennille. And I want to encourage y'all to visit the memorial website. And I also want to thank Tennille and the Memorial Committee. They have documented every step along the way, and they're very generous in sharing their experiences with other communities. So thank you, Tennille. And we are going to move on to our last but not least presenter, and that is my colleague, Aurelia Sands-Bell, is going to talk about unexpected challenges. Aurelia?
Thank you, Anne. We're just going to go on to our next slide because I know time is of the essence here. These are kind of the 4 key concepts that if you can kind of think about these things as you deal with any of the challenges that you might be facing. First of all, understanding that recovery can be long and it can become complicated. There's no standard time for recovery. Individuals' needs versus community needs can affect how services are offered and accessed. Conflict can arise due to limited or lack of choices, and that some challenges may be predictable while others may not. I do want to say in advance that the NMBVRC has amassed a lot of information, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but they're there on our website, and we've got that referenced for you. The first thing is there's the challenge of definitions, and so trying to understand what the definition of a mass violence is kind of complicated, because you have the federal government with a different definition, you have law enforcement with different definitions, and then you have the community with a different definition of it. And these definitions can also impact how victims and people are identified as victims, how funding is shared, how services are offered, and other things. The varying definitions also of who is a victim, who is a survivor, who is a witness, who is a first responder. It would be so helpful to have a unified definition. So we continue to say that and hopefully move towards that in the future. Next. Again, organized chaos. I like so much that that was referenced a lot by Mayor Dyer, but he said in the beginning, so many things happen at once, but because they had a plan, they had a proper response to be able to go out and to provide those services. And I want you to know that plans are not perfect, but they offer and can provide a very helpful starting point. Next. Our challenge number 3 is looking at historical or hate-based trauma. And a lot of that was talked about with Alyssa when she talked about even looking at assessments. These different types of crimes play out across our country and have played out across our country in so many different ways. They are very traumatizing and re-traumatizing. The trauma emanates from these type of crimes can be long and can be persistent and can stir a lot of long-term existing trauma that people may not even have truly approached. Next. Because the next thing is that we continue to have this conversation. I would just say this to providers: be educated about historical trauma and how it impacts your community. Look around, see who's there, and see how you can begin to have those kinds of conversations. I loved what Till talked about, collaboration. And collaboration means that we're having conversations with all groups of our society. You can't explain it, and you can't qualify it, and you can't justify it, but trying to listen to what people's experience is and being involved and engaged with them, talking to the people who are the trusted community members can really help you as you try to build trust and validate those experiences. Our next one. Challenge number 4, we looked at, and I thought about accessibility to services, because I think that's a key piece. And it's a very broad look at how we are inclusive in the kinds of services that we provide. First, beginning with location. Where do we establish services? Are we doing it because it's rent-free, or are we doing it because it's really close to the impacted community? And then sometimes the impacted community needs to have a little distance from where the trauma occurred. So be certain to have conversations, and don't just do things because it's quick and it's convenient, but be thoughtful about how we do that. Watch for that displaced anger. It's going to be there, and it, in many cases, is justified. And providers who make outreach early with trusted community agencies and engage them in partnerships to provide services are very successful. Again, I listened carefully to what Tanel said about the need to collaborate and how their agency is doing that, but they're doing it in a collaborative manner. Any type of resource that we share has to be respectful and reflect the community's language and their culture. It's got to be age appropriate. It's got to meet the needs of the disabilities community. And it's got to be on diverse levels of education and on sexual orientation and so many other different aspects. But being conscious of these things allows us to provide good, accessible services. Our fifth challenge that we want to highlight today is to ensure inclusion. Again, kind of a continuation, but such a necessary emphasis on how do we include all survivors and communities. Sometimes victims and communities can feel overlooked, and special care is needed to ensure that these issues are adequately addressed. And I listened when Amy brought it up, even feeling past traumas, feeling as though they are forgotten. And it's not that, it's just sometimes so many different things are happening and people are into their own feelings, and we have to acknowledge that. Any type of response plan has to be updated on a regular basis so that we are making certain that we're routinely qualifying what we do, and that it is the best thing that's necessary for our services. Be creative and remember that there is no wrong door to getting services and help to impacted communities. Next. There are different perceptions of what community means. It's so very different. And you heard that again with our other presenter who talked about even though there were mass violence incidents that occurred kind of close to each other, they each had their own different perspective about what was their community and how it impacted them. Allow those communities to self-identify and define their own communities. Work to unify those communities as much as possible. Not only do individuals hurt, but also communities hurt. Again, something that I heard the mayor talk about in his remarks. Next. And believe it or not, conflict can be a part of that recovery process. No one likes conflict. I get it, but it is an inevitable part of that process of kind of working it out and working it through. It can be difficult at the best of times, but every skill that you have, you bring to the table to problem solve, to listen to what people say, to learn from them, to do conflict management. All of that is so critically important. And that the source of that conflict must be clearly identified so that it can be addressed and resolved. Any undercurrent will continue to dismantle what you're trying to do. There are different views about recovery and resilience. Big words, a lot of stuff to consider, but recovery and resilience cannot simply just be achieved. It is a work. It is a work in progress. I love the little diagram that Amy had, the squiggly lines, because it isn't linear. It's a lot of hard work. But by working with a mental health or behavioral health specialist, individual growth and their improvement can be assessed. And they kind of can tell us how they're feeling. They're agreed upon benchmarks. So working with the community and working with individuals and making certain that we're looking at individuals as well as communities about the indications or indicators of community progress and individual progress is critically important. Sustainability. We're all facing that, and that's the need for victims and communities where they extend further than they originally planned. You don't know what you know until you get into something. Regular assessments, as Dr. Reingold talked about victims and their particular needs is critical. Think beyond your federal dollars, your state funding, because the needs of victims can extend far beyond the limits of that funding. And number 10, communities rush to get back to normal. That's normal. Community leaders want to restart the economy. They want to forget, but I will say to you that there's no time limit on individual or community recovery from trauma. And if you try to jump over that, you will find perhaps down the road that you're back at that process that you need to relook things. Moving forward with compassion in the very best interest of your community, and sometimes even working with public relations agencies can help rebrand and rejuvenate communities, as one of our speakers talked about earlier. And as we move on, in conclusion, a mass violence incident can create many different challenges and changes, whether for an individual or for a community. You just need to maintain services for as long as possible and be sure that those services are evidence-based and trauma-informed, because recovery can be a lengthy process, and there's no absolute time frame. Respect the community's cultural identity, listen to each other, and learn. And finally, responders, please take care of yourself. Be mindful of your own mental and emotional health needs.
Thank you so much, Aurelia. There should be no wrong doors. And as service providers, we have to be sure that our doors are not only open for survivors and community members, but also trauma-informed and culturally competent. Really important message. So we have shared lots of information with you, and now we are going to ask each of our presenters to describe what they think is the most important strategy or skill that's needed for professionals to help survivors and to help their communities on the road to recovery following mass violence. And we are going to start with Tennille. One strategy or skill.
So mine would be collaborative advocacy. So it's probably a fair statement to say that some days it can feel like herding cats, but really advocating collectively in your community and kind of moving them in that direction.
Thank you, Tennille. And Las Vegas and Clark County, y'all are a perfect example of that. We really appreciate that. Amy, what's your key takeaway, please?
The key takeaway for me from a provider perspective is to be patient, but from a victim person impacted perspective, it's to ask for help, the skill of asking for help, to think about what stops you from asking for help. What is in the way? Is it thoughts or beliefs about what it means about us if we ask for help? What does it sound like to ask for help? And to practice asking for help, and to know that there's never a wrong time to ask for a professional intervention of any kind.
And the right time may be immediately afterwards, and it may be years later. So thank you so much for that, Amy. Really, I'm sure you have an important skill or strategy to share.
Well, I was just thinking, expect the unexpected, as these challenges will occur, and we can address this by planning and listening, learning, and empathy.
Great, thank you so much, Aurelia. Again, planning is so foundational to everything that we're talking about in terms of the road to longer term recovery. And Dr. Reingold, bring us home with your strategy or skill, please.
Well, as I kind of talked about before, making sure you're engaging in ongoing assessments, both individual needs assessments, as well as community capacity needs assessments, and making sure those assessments are done within the context of your own community and the event that they may have experienced.
Nice finish, really. Thank you so much, Dr. Reingold. And now we're going to go to our questions from the field. I want to tell you all that we could spend 3 days answering the amazing questions we got. We realize that a lot of them have been answered by the presentations of our presenters. And so we've got a few that we are going to ask folks to be able to address the mental health impact of mass violence on victim survivors, family members, and community members. That's a pretty broad question. And I'm going to start with Amy. Do you mind taking that?
Yeah, Anne, can you repeat the first part of that? You went out for a second.
I'm sorry. How do we best support the mental health impact of mass violence on victim survivors, family members, and community members?
Thank you. So I think as service providers, to have the language to use, somebody mentioned that earlier. So there's the real language around being a person impacted by mass violence, to have a very non-judgmental approach and open approach, and to be patient, not expecting that somebody's going to come in and want to share their story. And if somebody comes in and wants to share their story, having the capacity to be able to hold that and receive it, because that can be very overwhelming. Victims and survivors sometimes are afraid to let other people know what's trapped inside their bodies. Sometimes it's horrific and in their minds. So to be really patient, and as providers also, not only to make sure you understand your own bias about things like physical versus psychological injuries, and also to be really educated on the best way, evidence-based practices to support a survivor.
Great, thank you so much, Amy. And I'm wondering if Alyssa, Dr. Reingold, do you want to also answer that question from the field?
Sure. To kind of pick up from Amy's response, definitely great. So intervention can start from just empathetic listening and holding space, as Amy kind of mentioned, and it can move along the continuum depending on what somebody needs, up to more trauma-focused, evidence-based treatments. And there are some that are out there, and there are some that are shown to be effective. Our website, the National Mass Violence Victimization Center website, does have some information on how to find therapists that engage in evidence-based strategies, as well as highlight some of those different types of trauma and grief-focused evidence-based strategies. But just kind of being knowledgeable, both as a broker, somebody that's helping survivors, as a mental health professional, getting trained now on different types of trauma-focused treatments can be helpful, so you're best prepared to help your community, starting from early intervention, like psychological first aid, all the way up to longer-term treatment interventions, such as cognitive processing therapy, for instance. So,
and Dr. Reingold, not everyone's a mental health professional, but many victim service professionals will end up, you call them brokers or navigators. So it's really important for them to be aware of what both you and Amy said. We're very big on evidence-based practices at our center, and being aware of them and going to our website and learning more about them. Okay, our next question. I think I'm going to give this one to you. How do you prepare victims and their families for trial? Not every MVI is going to result in trial, but lately there seems to have been a lot of them that go to trial.
Yeah, that's a good question. We haven't until very recently started to see a lot of trials around these kinds of crimes, because quite frankly, you didn't have a perpetrator to take to trial. So now, looking at trials, and trials occur generally years after the mass violence incident, and they require a lot of coordination, because you have so many people who identify as victims, who identify as witnesses, who want to come forth and be a part of the criminal justice process for what they determine will be their opportunity for justice, to be heard, to be seen, to voice what their experience has been. So there are so many questions about who would be allowed to participate, at what level they would be allowed to participate, depending on who is, in charge of the case, whether it's a state case or whether it's a federal case or both. You have to have coordination for those crimes. One of the things that the center did, the National Crime Victim Center did, was to develop a document called the Comprehensive Guide to help advocates plan and manage trial response. That document is available on our website, and it literally walks you through all of what it takes to coordinate a trial of those levels. And we've learned a lot from our some of the people that we've worked with the Mother Manual, with I'm trying to think Pittsburgh, just so many of the cases that have gone to trial, and each community has its own unique take on what that looks like. So I would just say to you, be honest with with the victims and survivors, or with the information that's shared. work to help them manage their expectations at all levels. You know, we talk a lot about justice in this country. It looks different. The outcome might not be what they want, but work with them to manage their expectations.
Thank you, Aurelia. And yes, we will put a link to the court guide in chat. It's also in the resource page that y'all will be able to get on our website afterwards. And I just want to mention, you know, recently we've been dealing with the mass shooting in Oxford, and it's a alleged juvenile assailant in the case. Just this week, the alleged perpetrator in Boulder, years later after the mass shooting, was just found competent to stand trial. So there's a lot of nuances that people need to be aware of, and we're really proud of our court guide. We will put that in chat, and we encourage you all to use it as a reference. And our last question, I think we have time to address. I'm going to give this to Tennille. How do you most effectively engage community and civic leaders to continue to address the long-term impact over many, 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 many years when sometimes they may not want to?
So I bring the victim's voice to them. And, you know, I think there's no way more effective than to tell their stories directly to them, right? I get an audience before them and I'll say, here's what we're seeing, but to tell that individual story of, you know, an impacted person and what they're going through. And then I bring them solutions. Here's what we can do to provide this support. And then, you know, the ask, here's how you can support me in doing this work. And so, but again, it's that victim's voice.
Which is, again, the power of the personal story is kind of thematic in everything that we've heard about today. And Amy makes a good point. Writing victim impact statements can be really helpful for the healing process. My question is, do we have time for one more question? And do we have that question? Claudia, question from the field.
No, ma'am.
Okay. We'll go to our next slide. So, first of all, I want to thank our presenters for a really robust conversation today, and also to Blondell and to Mayor Dyer for really getting us started on the right journey on the road to recovery. Really appreciate everyone's input today. If you want to request a consultation or technical assistance from our center, you can email us at info@nmvvrc.org. I want to remind you all to visit our website, follow us on social media. We are putting stuff out there on a daily basis. And everything that we have from this National Town Hall will be posted on our website very, very soon, and you will be able to access that as well as archived national town halls. Our next national town hall, I'm really, really excited about this. It's going to be sometime in November, 3 months from now. And by popular demand, we are going to focus on first responders. They are the folks who do so much to not only help survivors in the immediate aftermath, but their responses are really seminal to building the community response and recovery in the longer term, what we're talking about today. So if you are signed up for our newsletter and on our listserv, we will send you the date and time of the next National Town Hall. And before signing off, we would like all of you to complete our survey. It really does help us with OVC. They like to know what you think about us, and you can take a little picture of this QR code or go to the link that is right there. And we'll keep that up for a minute. And then Claudia, we'll go back to the slide where folks can learn how to directly contact our presenters from today. All right, we're going to keep this up for just a minute. If you want to take a little picture, or you can email us, we'll be glad to put you in touch with any of our wonderful speakers from today and the organizations they represent. And on behalf of the National Crime Victims, and on behalf of the National Mass Violence Victimization Resource Center, I want to thank everybody for joining our 7th National Town Hall. We hope you found the information to be useful. We hope that you learned some new skills and strategies that will be helpful to you in your own community should you ever face a mass violence incident. We're always here for you, so do not be strangers. We are grateful for the work that you do in your communities. And I personally am grateful to these amazing women who gave us such a powerful national town hall today. Thank you all so very much. Bye. And I'm seeing hearts and claps floating. So I think that's our instant evaluation is making me very happy. And thank you for your comments in chat. We really appreciate them. They're very validating.